Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In a vast manor house perched on the edge of town, behind an ivy-covered wrought iron gate, lived a man called Mr. Adrian Delville. This was no ordinary manor. It was a kingdom frozen in time, where every room seemed to wait for a breath that would never come. The walls were lined with expensive paintings, portraits of solemn ancestors, misty landscapes and sepia tones, still lives whose flowers seemed to fade a little more each day. Beneath the tall, thickly curtained windows, dust danced in the slightest ray of sunlight, as if the past itself were reluctant to leave. The corridors were long, silent, lined with Persian rugs and lined with antique console tables, lined with forgotten art objects. In this sanctuary of luxury and solitude, silence reigned supreme, interrupted sometimes by the creaking of wood or the distant hum of an old radiator. Adrian Delville, once an internationally renowned real estate magnate, had owned it all: skyscrapers in Dubai, hotels in Paris, villas in the hills of Malibu. He had built empires, negotiated fortunes. His name inspired respect and ambition. But since the sudden death of his wife and only son in a plane crash 5 years earlier, he was nothing more than a wealthy ghost among the living. The shock had split his soul like ice shattering under a weight that was too heavy. That day, something had died inside him, irremediably. Since then, Adrian had lived as a recluse, locked away in the mansion he had bought for his family, but which, deprived of laughter and voices, was nothing more than a luxurious mausoleum. He spent his days in a dark wood-paneled office, sitting behind a desk too wide for one man, rereading old crumpled newspapers or staring longingly at the faded photographs that sat on the mantelpiece. His son at the piano, his wife in a summer dress, both frozen in a bygone happiness. He spoke little, almost never. It was said of him, in the few circles that still remembered him, that he was stone cold, insensitive, cut off from the world. But the truth was more tragic. He was bleeding in silence, a little more each day. Every morning at 7 o'clock sharp, a cleaning lady came through the service door, that old metal door that only servants used. Her name was Alina, in her 30s, with a light step. She was always dressed simply and wore a black scarf that she tied behind her head like a ritual gesture. Her dark eyes, filled with a contained sadness, systematically avoided Adrian's. She knew how to make herself forgotten, and that was precisely why she was kept. She cleaned silently, with meticulous precision, as if every movement were weighed, measured, respectful of the emptiness that reigned in these places. She never made a noise, never left a trace. She moved through the corridors like a benevolent shadow, caressing the furniture with a soft cloth, arranging the curtains, scrubbing the old floors with monastic patience. But what Mr. Delville was unaware is that Alina was not just a cleaning lady. She carried a past, a whole world behind her discreet gestures. Born far from here, in a country where war had buried dreams, she had once been a piano prodigy, a child whose fingers told stories that words could not. Her life had fallen into exile, loss, long administrative queues, and odd jobs. She had fled, yes, but she had never forgotten. His hands, although experienced with brooms and buckets, kept the keyboard memory, a silent but burning language still lived within her. And in the solitude of the manor, between two erased dusts and a polished mirror, this fire only asked to be reborn. Alina, silent and withdrawn, was an invisible treasure, a soul hidden in the shadows of a world too noisy to hear it. And the fingers she hid under cleaning gloves were able to awaken emotion in the dead themselves. That day, a thick curtain of rain fell on the manor, enveloping the building in a damp, gray veil that made the windows shimmer like frozen tears. The dull rumble of thunder, the distant echo of drops hitting the roof and the garden. Everything seemed to suspend time, further isolating this enclosed universe. Adrian, caught up in an unexpected last-minute meeting, had hurriedly left the manor, taking with him the heavy silence and his memories, leaving behind a palpable emptiness. In this great silence, Alina entered the vast living room, toe-dusted, her slim figure gliding gently between the antique furniture. Her gestures were precise, almost ritualistic. Every corner had to be cleaned, every surface free from oversight. His eyes suddenly lingered on a corner almost hidden under a thick sheet of dark red velvet. A familiar shape was hiding there. A grand piano, a black Steinway, imposing and majestic, but abandoned, almost forgotten, like a silent monument to a vanished past. Alina stopped, a shiver running down her spine. Her heart was beating faster, a mixture of apprehension and nostalgia. She checked that she was alone, that the walls of the manor could not surprise her. Then, with infinite gentleness, she lifted the sheet. The polished wood of the piano gleamed faintly under the gray light of the stormy sky. A deep, dark glow, both fragile and noble. She placed her hands on the keys, her fingers brushing against the cool wood. It had been years since she had touched a piano, since she had fled her country, shattered by war and loss. Her father, a passionate violinist, taken by violence. Her conservatory, closed forever. Her childhood dreams, abandoned like dead leaves in the wind. And yet, there, now, her fingers began to move without her really thinking about it. They danced with an instinctive memory, finding their way back to a piece she had composed in the shadows, in the silence of her lost nights. The music rose slowly, timid at first, then more assured. Slow, painful notes, laden with pure sadness. A melody at once simple and heartbreaking, like a whisper from the soul itself. This music filled the room, transforming it. Each chord resonated like an ancient breath, a scent of times gone by, a stifled cry from a child's heart. It seemed to touch invisible wounds, awaken ghosts, and invite compassion. Without knowing how, Alina let herself be carried away, playing with a sincerity that untied the knots of her pain. She was no longer the silent cleaning lady, but a lost artist finding her voice again. What she didn't know was that in the doorway, someone was listening to him. Adrian Delville stood there, motionless, holding his breath, his eyes shining with an emotion he hadn't let escape him for years. He had returned, silently, drawn by this music he recognized, for which his heart had long hoped. Each note seemed to contain all his pain, all the ache of his losses, all the loneliness he had endured in silence. It was like hearing his son speak to him again, as if the child were reaching out to him through the melody. When Alina stopped suddenly, panicked at the sight of the man she thought was missing, her heart pounding, she stood up quickly. A heavy silence fell. Then, Adrian's voice, deep and trembling, finally broke the tension. "Was that you?" She lowered her head, ashamed. "I am sorry, sir. I didn't mean." He interrupted her gently, his gaze a mixture of admiration and sadness. "No, don't apologize. I heard my son." He played with the same sincerity. A suspended moment, where two broken souls recognized each other in the silence, in the music. That day, behind the cold walls of the manor, an invisible door had half opened. The day after, as the sun shyly filtered through the heavy living room curtains, Adrian found Alina at the foot of the stairs, silently sweeping the parquet floor. He approached slowly, his heart beating faster than he would have thought possible. "Alina, could you play again today?" he asked, his voice hesitant, almost fragile. She looked up at him in surprise, then lowered her head, hesitant. The idea of revealing this part of herself once again, buried for so long, troubled her deeply. But there was such expectation, such vulnerability, in Adrian's gaze that she gently accepted. She walked back to the piano, her fingers trembling slightly. As the first notes rose, a shudder ran through the room. Adrian sat in the armchair opposite her, speechless, absorbed in the music. Day after day, this ritual took hold. Every morning, after finishing her chores, Alina played, and Adrian listened, sometimes with his eyes closed, sometimes motionless, sometimes with tears in his eyes. Little by little, the manor, which for the past 5 years had become a mausoleum frozen in time, seemed to come back to life. The walls seemed to breathe again, perfumed by the music. The empty rooms filled with memories that no longer just hurt, but softened the pain. Through their silent exchanges, Adrian got to know Alina. She gradually confided in him her story. A child prodigy in a war-torn country, she had fled alone, crossed borders, survived in foster homes, abandoning her dreams and her violinist father. She had kept this music as a last link to her past, to her dignity. She gradually discovered the man behind the cold mask, a broken father and husband, consumed by guilt for failing to protect his loved ones. His silence was nothing but the weight of an unspeakable grief. Through the music she played for him, the pieces she composed in secret in the solitude of her small apartment, she offered him a bridge to the light. One by one, the walls cracked. Adrian repaired the piano himself, cleaning each key, oiling the mechanisms, restoring life to the instrument which, like a mirror, now reflected the rebirth of the master of the house. He opened the windows, finally letting in fresh air and sunshine. He spoke of his son, his wife, the memories he kept buried in his pockets. And one evening, in the dim light of the living room, he cried for the first time in 5 years, while Alina's music filled the room with a soothing sweetness. Then came an exceptional evening. Adrian invited an old friend, the director of the city's music conservatory, a man with a piercing gaze and an infallible memory. He wanted to introduce him to Alina, without telling him beforehand. The large living room was bathed in dim light, the atmosphere heavy with expectation. Alina, at first trembling before this unknown man, sat down at the piano. Her fingers brushed the keys, and soon the music exploded, full of life and passion, as if each note told the story of an entire life, of all the wounds, of all the hopes. At the last note, a solemn silence fell. The old man stared at her for a long time, his eyes clouded with emotion. "This woman is a genius. You have fire in your hands, miss," he declared with sincere admiration. Adrian stood up, his face filled with a new emotion. He then announced a decision that shocked Alina. "I'll fund a scholarship in your name, to allow artists like you who have come from the shadows to finally shine. And I want you to be the first recipient." She shook her head, refusing at first with humility, the fear of reliving the disappointment chaining her to silence. But Adrian, his eyes shining with tears, insisted, "You gave me back my humanity. Let me give you back your destiny." It was the beginning of a new life. A silent pact between two wounded souls, a shared journey toward the light. 1 year later, the capital's grand concert hall was packed. Every seat occupied, every row filled with an attentive audience, ready to hear a new musical star. The dim lighting created a hushed, almost sacred atmosphere. One could feel the suspended, almost palpable anticipation, like a held breath. Backstage, behind the heavy red velvet curtain, Adrian stood motionless, his heart pounding. He was no longer the broken man he once was, but this evening held the weight of a fragile dream. He thought back to all those mornings when, in the shadows of a deserted manor, he had listened to Alina play, rediscovering life through her notes. Today, she was here, ready to deliver her music to the world. Then a soft, firm voice announced, "Alina Delville." The audience applauded softly as she made her entrance, wearing a simple but elegant black dress. She sat down in front of the grand piano, gleaming in the spotlight, the same instrument that had been their first connection, their silent confidant. A deep breath, and her hands fell on the keys. The silence in the room became absolute, a silence vibrant with suppressed emotion. The piece she performed was not just a composition. It was an ode to loss, to exile, but also to resilience and hope. Every note seemed to tell a story: the pain of a country torn apart, the loneliness of a rootless child, the grief of a father mourning his loved ones, and the fragile light that shines through. The chords were sometimes gentle, sometimes powerful, playing on contrasts like the waves of an inner ocean. Time seemed to stand still, each spectator becoming the custodian of an intimate secret shared by Alina and Adrian. At the end of the piece, thunderous applause erupted, mixed with stifled sobs. Tears streamed down several faces. Others stood up, overwhelmed by the truth conveyed by the music. Alina stood, bowing her head gracefully. Then her eyes searched the room for Adrian. Their gaze met in the dressing room, and in that simple, silent exchange, their entire story could be read. Two wounded souls, brought together by music, transformed by the power of art and compassion. After this triumph, Alina became a renowned pianist, acclaimed in the greatest halls. But she never completely left the manor that had been the cradle of her rebirth. She returned there often, at least once a month, to play in the large living room with its walls adorned with paintings, or to share tea with Adrian. in that fragile but indestructible bond. Adrian, for his part, had found a new purpose in life. Together, they created a music house for refugee children, a place of welcome, sharing, and learning to offer others what life had stolen from them: hope, a voice, a future. And sometimes, when the house was quiet, Alina played alone in the manor's living room. The piano, once silent, seemed to sing with her, vibrating to the rhythm of her emotions. The walls seemed to breathe, silent witnesses to a story of pain transformed into beauty. For in this once frozen house, life had returned, full, intense, luminous. And music, that universal language, now told a story no one would ever forget.